A patient in Bay 3 saw it first. The way the doctor's hand closed around the nurse's wrist. The way she tried to pull back and couldn't. Everyone in that ER heard what he said to her. Nurses, residents, the cleaning staff restocking gloves. And every single one of them kept working like nothing happened. Except the man sitting in the corner. He stood up, walked over, put his hand on the doctor's shoulder. Let her go. The doctor turned around ready to dismiss him, and his face went completely white. Whatever the man said next, he said it quietly, but within 2 minutes, hospital security was escorting Dr. Kingston out of the building. Within an hour, his medical license was under review. Within 3 days, 23 other complaints surfaced, all because one person refused to look away. If you've ever watched someone get treated like they were invisible and said nothing, this one's going to stay with you. Stay with it until the end. You'll want to see how this plays out.
The ER at Mercy General ran on controlled chaos. Monitors beeping at different rhythms, gurneys cutting sharp corners, a man in Bay 3 arguing that he didn't need stitches, just some butterfly bandages and maybe a sandwich. The overhead PA crackling with codes and room numbers in a voice so calm it felt robotic. Nurses moving the way water moves, finding paths through every gap, around every obstacle, never fully stopping. Addison Keller had worked this floor for 6 years. She knew every sound in here the way you know the sounds of your own apartment at night. The specific beep of a cardiac monitor running low on battery. The squeaky left wheel on the gurney from Bay 2 that maintenance had been promising to fix since February. The particular silence that fell when someone's numbers dropped fast. She was standing at the medication cart outside Bay 6, drawing up 4 mg of morphine for a 63-year-old woman who had been waiting 2 hours with a fractured hip. No complaint from the woman, not a word, just a kind of stillness that people develop when they've been in enough pain long enough to stop expecting it to end quickly. Addison was almost done when she heard the residents coming. She didn't need to look up, she already knew. Dr. Daniel Kingston moved through the ER on rounds like he owned the floor, the equipment, the oxygen in the air. 6'2", athletic in that effortless way that came from a personal trainer and not from actual labor, silver just starting at his temples in a way that photographed well. He was 44 years old and had been the subject of 3 magazine profiles, a hospital fundraiser gala poster, and 1 near lawsuit that had quietly disappeared before it ever reached paper. His residents followed him in a cluster, 4 of them today, all second years, all holding their tablets at the same careful angle that said, "Please don't call on me." Keller. She finished drawing the morphine before she turned. Kingston was standing 10 feet away with his residents fanned out behind him, one hand already moving to the chart he clearly hadn't reviewed before rounds. He had the specific expression of a man who had never once questioned whether he had the right to interrupt someone mid-task. "I need you to explain something to me," he said, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who never had to raise it to be heard, because apparently my orders from yesterday weren't followed. Addison capped the syringe carefully, set it in the tray. "Which orders?" "The Dyer's patient, Bay 9. I ordered a repeat echo for this morning. It's 11:40 and nobody's ordered transport. The echo department called her equipment hold at 7 a.m. I documented it in the chart and sent you a message through the system at 7:15. She kept her voice even. I also called up to cardiology to flag the delay." "A beat." Kingston's jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was recalculating. "You should have called me directly. The protocol is—" "I don't care about the protocol." He stepped closer, and something in the air around the medication cart compressed. "I care that my patient didn't get her echo, and instead of making sure that happened, you sent a message. I followed the escalation process." "You covered yourself." He said it the way you'd say you lied. "There's a difference between covering yourself and actually doing your job." One of the residents looked down at her tablet. Another shifted his weight to the back foot. Addison was used to this. That was the thing nobody outside hospital walls quite understood, the way a floor like this one ran on a dual system. The official system, protocols, escalation chains, documentation, peer review. And the unofficial one, who had the power to make your life difficult, whose name carried enough weight to flip a performance review, whose complaints landed differently with HR depending on the last name attached to them. Kingston operated entirely in the second system, and he was fluent in it in ways most people never fully saw until it was too late. She was about to respond, calmly, precisely, the way she'd learned to when he reached out and grabbed her wrist. Hard. His fingers wrapped around the bones of her wrist, like a clamp closing. The syringe tray rattled when her arm jerked back from the cart. "You embarrassed me," he said, low, controlled, leaning in close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, "in front of my residents." The ER didn't stop. The monitors kept beeping. A gurney rolled past the end of the corridor. Someone coughed in Bay 4. But the space around them went very, very still. "Let go," Addison said. Her voice came out quieter than she wanted it to. "He didn't." "You're a nurse," Kingston said, not loud, just flat like he was stating a fact about furniture. "Act like one." A woman in the waiting area intake chairs, older, grey hair, a grandchild on her lap, turned her head. The child stopped fidgeting and just stared with the open, unfiltered attention that only very young children and very old people still allow themselves. A resident near the nurse's station put his pen down. Nobody moved. Addison pulled against his grip. She couldn't break it. There was a term for what was happening, and it wasn't just physical. Workplace research calls it status aggression, the specific behavior pattern where someone in a dominant institutional position uses physical or psychological force not just to control, but to remind everyone watching exactly where power sits. Kingston wasn't just grabbing her wrist, he was making a demonstration, for the residents, for the floor, for anyone watching. She felt it. The humiliation was its own separate thing from the pain, and it was worse. "Please," she said, and hated herself a little for the word. He squeezed once more, a deliberate punctuating pressure, and then released her, stepped back, smoothed the front of his white coat. The whole performance took maybe 8 seconds. The ER went back to its noise. Almost. Because across the room, in the far corner beside the curtained bed of Bay 11, a man stood up. He'd been there the whole time, sitting in one of those molded plastic visitor chairs that every hospital buys in bulk, a charcoal overcoat folded neatly across his knee. Korean, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of stillness that didn't come from patience so much as from a person who had learned that stillness itself was a form of information. He'd been watching since Kingston crossed the floor. He walked forward. Not fast, not slow. The kind of pace that people use when they've already decided what they're going to say and don't need the extra seconds to prepare. The space between beds wasn't wide. He moved through it without brushing a single curtain. He stopped about 6 feet from Kingston. "Remove your hand from her." The ER went quiet. Not silent, the machines kept running, but the human noise dropped out of it. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Someone near the intake desk stopped typing. Kingston turned. The irritation on his face was immediate and genuine. He was not a man accustomed to interruption from strangers in his own ER. "Excuse me," he said it like 2 separate words. "This is a medical facility. Sit down." The man didn't sit. "Remove your hand from her," he repeated. Same tone, same volume, like he hadn't heard the instruction to sit or had heard it and simply set it aside. Kingston released a short laugh. "I don't know who you think you are, but you need to. Remove your hand." Something shifted, not in the man's expression, that stayed completely level, but in the room itself. One of the residents took a small, involuntary step backward. The nurse at the station looked up from her chart. Addison had pulled her wrist back to her chest, without realizing she'd done it. She was pressing her right thumb into the skin where his fingers had been. The Korean man looked at her, not through her, at her the way doctors sometimes forgot to. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she said automatically. 6 years of this floor had built that answer into her. It was the only safe answer. "I'm fine" was the answer that didn't start incidents, didn't invite documentation, didn't get you pulled aside by a supervisor later to discuss whether you were creating a difficult work environment. "I'm fine" was the answer that let you get back to your patient in Bay 6, who was still waiting on that morphine. The man nodded once, like he understood exactly what "I'm fine" actually meant. He looked back at Kingston. "You assaulted her." Kingston laughed. This one was louder, more performative, directed at the residents like he was inviting them to appreciate the absurdity. "Assault," I corrected insubordination. "You grabbed her wrist hard enough to move the equipment on that cart." The man gestured toward the tray without looking at it, in front of patients, in front of staff, with no provocation. "With all due respect." "Who are you?" Kingston cut in, his voice sharpening. "Because I'm about to call security." He didn't have to call. 2 security guards were already moving toward the far corner, directed by a head nod from the charge nurse who had watched the whole thing from the station. Protocol: any visitor altercation, you move toward it. The Korean man didn't move. The guards reached him, and then Marcus Webb, who had been head of hospital security for 11 years and had seen most things, stopped walking. He looked at the man in the charcoal overcoat. Something crossed Webb's face. Not fear exactly, more like the expression of a man who has just opened a door expecting a closet and found a staircase going down. He knew this man. Not personally, but he knew the name attached to the face, the same way you might recognize someone whose photograph you'd seen in documents you weren't supposed to look at too closely. Mun Shi-hoon, Korean national, private investor, the anonymous benefactor listed in the funding acknowledgements of the hospital's trauma simulation wing, the oncology expansion, the surgical robotics lab that the board had celebrated at last year's gala. His name wasn't on a plaque anywhere, it was in paperwork. The kind of paperwork that moved through board meetings and got summarized for the chairman in private. Webb stopped. The second guard almost walked into him. Kingston watched the exchange, and for the first time in the entire incident, the certainty left his face. Not completely, but enough to be visible. He looked at the man again, the overcoat, the posture, the complete absence of any reaction to Kingston's name or presence, and something recalculated behind his eyes. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Kingston said, but the sentence had lost weight somewhere in the middle of it. Mun Shi-hoon put his hands in his coat pockets. His eyes moved from the security guards to Kingston, with the calm, organized attention of someone reviewing a situation he had already mapped 3 moves ahead. "Doctor," he said quietly. Just that, just the word, then. "We need to talk. What would you have done if you'd been standing in that ER?" Nobody left. That was the first thing worth noticing. The ER had 30-something people in it, patients, staff, residents, one orderly who had stopped pushing a linen cart and was now standing very still near the supply room door, and not one of them walked away. They all found reasons to stay exactly where they were, checking charts, adjusting IV lines, staring at tablet screens that weren't showing anything new. The pretense of work is a very specific thing, and everyone in that room had mastered it in the last 45 seconds. Marcus Webb and his second guard had not moved. They stood about 8 feet back, technically present, technically available to intervene, technically doing nothing at all. Kingston recovered first. He had a talent for it, the fast reset, the social recalibration. Addison had watched him do it after difficult family meetings, after complications he hadn't anticipated, after one particularly bad incident 2 years ago involving a first-year resident and a supply cabinet that everyone on the floor knew about and nobody talked about. He would absorb the friction of a moment and smooth himself back out like he was ironing a shirt. It took him maybe 4 seconds. He turned toward Mun Shi-hoon with the patient, faintly condescending expression of a man explaining traffic laws to someone who walked everywhere. "This isn't your concern," he said. "A man grabbing a woman's wrist in public is always my concern." No escalation in Mun's voice, no heat. He said it the way you'd state the boiling point of water, like it was simply a fact that existed independent of anyone's feelings about it. Kingston tilted his head slightly. "You don't understand hospital hierarchy." "I understand power," Mun replied. "How it moves, who holds it, what people do with it when they think nobody important is watching." The pause after that was about 2 seconds long. It felt longer. Kingston's residents were performing the most disciplined stillness Addison had ever seen from second years. Dr. Priya Mehta, who was usually the one most likely to ask follow-up questions, had her stylus pressed flat against her tablet screen and her eyes pointed at nothing. The young man next to her, whose name Addison could never remember despite seeing him 5 days a week, had found something very interesting on the far wall. Kingston exhaled through his nose, almost amused. "You're going to stand in my ER and lecture me about power?" "I'm going to ask you a question," Mun said. "That's all." He turned slightly toward Addison. Not a full pivot, more like the kind of adjustments a person makes when they're including someone in a conversation rather than talking at them. The small difference between the two was enormous, and she noticed it. "Has this happened before?" he asked her, quiet, direct. Addison's thumb was still pressed against her wrist, where the redness was beginning to surface under her brown skin. She'd been doing it unconsciously, the way you press a bruise. She didn't answer. But her eyes moved, just briefly, just for half a second to Kingston's face and then back down. It was the kind of involuntary movement that her body made before her training could stop it, and she hated it, because it said everything she wasn't going to say out loud. Mun saw it, he nodded once, very slightly, and didn't push. Koreans have a concept called nunchai, the almost intuitive ability to read a room, to understand what's being communicated through tone and posture and silence as much as through actual words. It's considered a social skill in Korea, the way conversational fluency is considered a skill elsewhere. A person with good nunchai knows when to speak, when to wait, and when the most important information in a conversation is the thing nobody is saying. Mun Shi-hoon had exceptional nunchai. He'd been reading this room since before Kingston opened his mouth. The silence stretched about 1 beat past comfortable. And then Ryan Cho, a second-year intern who had been standing closest to the medication cart during the whole incident, made a sound. Not a word. More like the small involuntary noise a person makes when they're deciding whether to speak and the decision tips. Actually, he started. He stopped. Kingston's eyes moved to him, fast and flat, like a camera panning. Ryan's mouth closed. Go ahead, Mun said, without looking at Kingston. Ryan glanced between them. He was 26 years old and had $280,000 in medical school debt and 18 months left in his residency. Addison knew because they talked about it once during a slow overnight shift, the particular math that residents did constantly in their heads. How long until I'm through this? How long until the debt starts shrinking? How long until I can make a decision without checking whether it'll cost me everything? Yeah, Ryan said, I've seen it before. He swallowed. Not exactly like this, but yeah. Kingston turned his full attention to Ryan. Dr. Cho, just the name, no other words. But his tone had the weight of everything that name implied, the hierarchy, the evaluation forms, the attending signatures on the paperwork that determined where Ryan went after his residency ended. The Hubi-Sunbi dynamic that structured most Korean professional environments was something Mun understood from the inside. In Korean workplaces, the relationship between a junior and senior was formal, codified, binding in ways that Westerners often underestimated. But American hospitals ran on a version of the same system, the chain of deference, the unspoken rule that your future was held in the hands of the people above you, and you protected those relationships at almost any cost. Kingston had been using that system for years. He knew exactly how much pressure a single look could carry. Ryan looked at his tablet. A beat. Then from the nurse's station, without looking up from her computer screen, Sandra Okafor spoke. She was 51 years old, had been at Mercy General for 19 years, and Addison had never once heard her raise her voice in any direction. It's happened, Sandra said, still not looking up, more than once. The typing didn't stop, her eyes stayed on the screen. It was the bravest thing Addison had seen in 6 years on this floor. A woman choosing to tell the truth in the most deliberately casual way possible, making it almost impossible to target directly, just a statement delivered to a computer monitor on a Tuesday morning. Kingston's neck had gone slightly red above his collar. Careful, he said, and the word landed with the precision of something thrown rather than spoken. It hit Sandra and Ryan and Priya, and the orderly near the supply room door, and 2 nurses who hadn't said anything at all. It was a warning issued to everyone in a 12-foot radius. Everyone heard it. Most of them responded to it, the way people respond to warnings they've heard before in this specific building from this specific person. They went quiet, looked away, found the nearest available surface to focus on. The ER resumed its background hum. Mun had been watching all of it. He turned back to Kingston now, and when he spoke, his voice was the same as it had been from the beginning, level, unhurried, not performing anything. Do you know what's interesting? He said. In Korean corporate culture, there's a practice called dogangsim, roughly translated. It means working in isolation, building your own insular system within a larger structure. It usually works well for the person at the center of it. For a while, he paused, until the structure is examined from outside. Kingston's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted, shoulders pulling back slightly, chin lifting. The defensive geometry of a man who hasn't been challenged like this in a very long time and is trying to remember what to do with it. Is that supposed to mean something to me? It means I've been reviewing this hospital's internal complaint records for the past 3 weeks, Mun said. Not as a patient, not as a visitor. He let that sit for a moment. How many complaints have been filed against you? He asked, genuinely curious in tone, the way a doctor asks about symptoms. Kingston smiled. It was the confident, slightly contemptuous expression of a man pulling out a card he knew was strong. None that mattered. The room's temperature didn't change. The monitors kept beeping. A phone rang at the nurse's station and was picked up after 2 rings. Everything continued exactly as it had been. But something had shifted, not in one person's expression or one person's posture, but collectively, the way a tide shifts. 3 or 4 people around the room who had been carefully not looking at Kingston now looked at him, just briefly, just long enough for it to register. None that mattered. Addison's wrist was throbbing. She thought about the complaint she'd filed 14 months ago, the forms she'd filled out in the HR office with a woman named Janet who had sympathetic eyes and a practiced way of saying we take all concerns seriously while typing on a keyboard whose clicks seemed slightly too fast for the actual words being entered. She'd never received a formal response. A month later, she was moved to night shifts for 6 weeks. When she asked about it, the shift supervisor said it was a staffing issue. When the staffing issue resolved itself, she was back on days, and nobody said anything about the complaint again. It hadn't disappeared, exactly. It had just become invisible, which is a different process with the same result. She found out later that 2 nurses from the surgical floor had filed similar reports in the 18 months before hers. One of them, a travel nurse named Becca, originally from Alabama, who had covered surgical for most of the winter, had transferred to another hospital before spring. The other had quietly moved to the pediatric floor, and as far as Addison knew, had not worked with Kingston since. None that mattered. Munn looked at Kingston for a long, unhurried moment. Then he turned to Marcus Webb. Webb straightened slightly by reflex. "Lock the doors," Munn said. Nobody moved for a full second. "I'm sorry," Webb said. The AR entrance, Munn's voice was patient. "No one leaves for the next few minutes." Ryan Cho looked up from his tablet. Priya's stylus stopped moving. Sandra Okafor's typing paused, then resumed, then paused again. Kingston's composure, which had held remarkably well through everything up to this point, developed its first visible crack. Not a break, just a fracture line, the kind you could see if you were looking for it. "You can't just, this is a functioning emergency department, you don't have the authority to." "Dr. Kingston," Munn said his name quietly, and somehow the quiet made it louder than anything else in the room. "I'm not asking you to stop working. I'm asking everyone to stay in the room they're already in." He looked around the ER once, methodically, the way you scan a document you're about to sign. "There are things that need to be said in front of witnesses," he said, "and I'd like to make sure the witnesses are here for it." Webb looked at Kingston. Kingston looked at Webb. Webb walked to the entrance and spoke to the guard at the exterior door. The automatic doors stayed closed. The ER continued its noise. Monitors, wheels, the low-frequency buzz of the overhead lights that Addison had stopped noticing years ago and was suddenly noticing again. Nobody left. And the conversation, which had started as one man grabbing a woman's wrist over a medication cart, stopped being a conversation. The locked doors changed the acoustics of the room. Not literally, the same monitors beeped, the same ventilation hummed in the ceiling, the same distant PA system called codes in its uninflected robotic voice, but the knowledge that the exterior entrance was closed did something to the way sound moved through the space. Conversations that had been happening at normal volume dropped. Movements became more considered. The ER, which ran on the organized chaos of constant entry and exit, had become a room with a perimeter, and everyone inside it felt that shift in their bodies before their brains finished processing it. Kingston stood near the central corridor with his arms crossed, the posture of a man performing composure rather than actually having it. "This is illegal," he said. "You understand that. Detaining hospital staff and patients against their will, that's false imprisonment. I want that noted." "The patients are receiving care," Munn said. "The staff are at work. Nobody is being detained. I'm asking people who are already in this room to stay in this room for a few minutes." He paused. "You're a surgeon. You understand the difference between a constraint and a boundary." Kingston's jaw worked slightly. He looked at Marcus Webb, who was still standing near the entrance with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided his job in this moment was to not have an opinion. "Fine," Kingston said. The word landed like a door closing. "Say whatever you came here to say." Munn took a breath, not dramatically, just the natural pause of someone organizing their thoughts before speaking, the kind of pause that Korean business culture actually formalized in negotiation settings. In high-stakes Korean corporate meetings, silence before speaking was considered a sign of respect and seriousness, not hesitation. You didn't rush your words when the words mattered. Westerners often misread it as uncertainty. It was the opposite. When I arrived in this city 8 months ago, Munn said, I was conducting due diligence on a portfolio of healthcare infrastructure investments. Mercy General was one of 6 institutions under review. He was looking at Kingston, but speaking at a volume that the room could follow. That review is ongoing. Kingston waited. The trauma simulation wing on the 4th floor, Munn continued. The oncology research unit. The surgical robotics lab that your department uses on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He stopped. Kingston's eyes had gone very still. I funded them, Munn said, not directly through an investment vehicle that holds several healthcare infrastructure assets, but the capital originated with my firm. The ER staff were not pretending to work anymore. Sandra Okafor had stopped typing entirely. Ryan Cho had put his tablet face down on the counter. Even the orderly near the supply room had stopped making any effort at invisibility and was simply watching. Kingston recalibrated. Addison could see him doing it, the rapid internal reclassification of this person, this situation, what the available moves were. He was very good at it. It was one of the things that made him effective and also one of the things that made him dangerous, the speed with which he could assess a new configuration and find the version of it that still worked in his favor. So you're a donor, he said, measured, almost warm actually, the tone reserved for benefactors at galas. With respect, that doesn't give you authority over clinical operations. No, Munn agreed, but I'm also the man currently auditing this hospital. The word auditing landed differently than any word that had been used in the last 30 minutes. Sandra's hand, which had been resting near her keyboard, went very still. One of the interns audibly stopped breathing for a second. Even Priya Mehta, who had been managing an expression of careful professional neutrality since this whole thing began, let something cross her face that she didn't fully catch in time. A formal audit of a hospital's financials and governance wasn't just an accounting exercise. It was a structural examination that could pull documentation from HR, compliance, risk management, legal settlements, board minutes. It had access to the paper trail that internal complaints couldn't reach because the people controlling the internal process were the same people with an interest in what was and wasn't found. An external audit with the backing of a major capital partner didn't need anyone's permission to look at anything. Kingston said nothing for a full 4 seconds. Your father is on the hospital board, Munn said, not a question. Something settled into Kingston's expression, the specific quality of a man who has just confirmed that his opponent knows more than he'd hoped. Yes, he said finally, he is. He almost smiled, not quite, the beginning of it, now you understand. The implication was clear and it had worked for 20 years. You know who my father is. You know what that means. Tread carefully. Munn shook his head, once slowly. No, he said, now you will. The almost smile stopped forming. Addison had been standing at the medication cart through the whole exchange, her completed documentation sitting in front of her, her wrist resting on the cool surface of the cart. She'd watched this particular dynamic play out in various forms for 6 years, the way Kingston's name and his father's name worked together as a closed system, a self-reinforcing structure that absorbed pressure and redirected it downward. A complaint went up and somehow came back as a performance issue. A concern was raised and somehow became evidence of poor attitude. The system didn't need anyone to be explicitly corrupt to function this way. It just needed people at every level to make the individually rational decision to protect themselves, and the structure did the rest. She thought about something her mother used to say, in the particular blunt way that West African mothers delivered truths they'd earned. The fish rots from the head. She'd grown up hearing it applied to politicians, to community leaders, to anyone whose visible corruption was really just the surface expression of a deeper institutional failure. It applied here with a precision that would have made her mother nod once and say nothing further. Kingston's composure was holding, but it had become rigid in a way that was different from confidence. Rigidity and confidence looked similar at a distance, but up close, under fluorescent hospital lights, you could tell them apart. You humiliate nurses in front of patients, Addison said. She hadn't planned to speak. The words came out of her the way words sometimes do when you've been holding them so long that the effort of continuing to hold them exceeds the risk of releasing them. She heard her own voice with a slight delay, like an echo arriving from a distance. Kingston turned to her. His expression was patient in the way that a teacher is patient with a student who has raised an incorrect answer. You're emotional, he said, which is understandable given the morning, but it's not a basis for. No, Munn said. Just that, clean and immediate, the same way you stop a sentence that's heading somewhere it shouldn't go. He looked at Addison, then back at Kingston. She's precise, he said. The distinction mattered. Emotional was dismissal. It reclassified an observation as a feeling, a documented pattern as a personal reaction, a professional complaint as a woman having difficulty managing herself. It was one of the most efficient silencing tools available in a professional environment because it required no engagement with the actual content of what was said. It worked constantly, and it worked especially well on women, and especially on black women, whose expressions of legitimate grievance had been labeled emotional and therefore discountable in American institutional settings with a consistency that was itself a documented pattern. Precise was the opposite. It said what she said was accurate. It said, she is an observer with data, not a person with feelings. It said, we're not discussing her emotional state, we're discussing her observation, which stands. Kingston looked at Munn for a long moment. The room had moved from pretending to work to simply watching. The pretense was fully gone now, and nobody was bothering to restore it. Munn reached into the inside pocket of his overcoat and took out a phone. He didn't show the screen to anyone. He held it in his hand and spoke with the even, methodical delivery of someone reading from a list they'd reviewed enough times to carry in their head. March 4th, he said, a first-year resident named Torres was directed by you to retrieve a patient file from the supply corridor off surgical. When he brought the wrong version, you shoved him backward into the cabinet rack. He hit the metal edge. He documented a bruised shoulder in his personal notes and did not file a formal report. He paused. He's working at Mount Sinai now. He transferred 6 months ago. Kingston's hands, which had been at his sides, moved to cross in front of him. May 19th, Munn continued. A nurse named Patricia Gunn raised a concern about a drug interaction during a pre-surgical review. In front of 2 other nurses and a pharmacy technician, you told her that if she questioned your clinical judgment again, you would make sure she never worked in this city's hospital system. She transferred to the pediatric floor within 3 weeks. He looked up briefly. She's still here. Bay 2, I think. Nobody looked at Bay 2. August 3rd, during a difficult family consultation, you threw a patient chart across the room when told the family had requested a second opinion. It struck the wall approximately 18 inches from a nurse who was standing there. No report was filed. The nurse who was standing there has not worked a direct shift with you since. Kingston's jaw was working silently, the muscles in his cheek visibly tight. September. Where did you get that? Kingston said, not a question. The words came out flat and hard, stripped of the professional polish that had been covering them. Security footage, Munn said. 6 months of it, reviewed as part of the operational audit. He held Kingston's gaze without any hostility, the way you look at something you're documenting rather than something you're afraid of. Hospitals in South Korea are required to maintain and submit internal incident documentation to an independent medical oversight board annually. It's a system that was implemented after several institutional misconduct cases in the early 2000s. The United States doesn't have an equivalent federal requirement. He let that sit for exactly 1 beat, which is why documentation like this stays internal, and why internal review can be managed by people with an interest in what's found. He put the phone back in his pocket. You have a pattern, Doctor. Kingston stood in the center of the ER floor and the room was completely still around him. Not hostile, there was no performance of judgment from the staff, no visible satisfaction, just attention. The clean, unavoidable attention of people who have heard something stated plainly that they had known imprecisely for a long time, and the experience of having it named was not triumph. It was more like the specific relief of a diagnosis. The thing was always there, and now it has a name, and now something can be done. Ryan Cho had his arms at his sides. Sandra Okafor was looking directly at Kingston, fully turned in her chair. Dominique, who had arrived for a cover shift and walked into something she hadn't been prepared for, was standing with her arms loosely crossed in the way of someone who has made a decision and is waiting to see what it requires of her next. Kingston looked at Munn for a long moment. When he finally spoke, the authority had come back slightly, but it was thinner now, like fabric that's been washed too many times. The weave was still there, but you could see through it if you held it to the light. Who exactly are you? He said. Not rhetorical. He actually wanted the answer, the specific professional identity, the title or affiliation he could run against his internal database of who mattered and how much and what leverage existed. Mun Shi-hoon looked at him. The man who decides what happens next, he said. And the thing was, it wasn't a threat. It didn't have the temperature of a threat. It was simply an accurate statement of fact, delivered by someone who had walked into an ER in a charcoal overcoat that morning and sat in a plastic visitor chair and watched a man grab a nurse's wrist, and had then spent the last 30 minutes making the situation legible to everyone in the room. He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't made promises. He just steadily, methodically removed the architecture that had kept one man's behavior invisible, piece by piece, in front of witnesses. Kingston looked at him for another moment. Then his phone buzzed in his coat pocket. He looked at the screen. Whatever was on it did something to his face that 6 years of watching him hadn't prepared Addison for. Not anger, not calculation, but something that looked almost like the recognition of an ending. The face of a man receiving confirmation of something he'd been hoping wouldn't arrive. He put the phone back in his pocket without answering. Outside the locked doors, the city continued. A siren moved past on the street. Somewhere in the hospital above them, elevators opened and closed. Life moved at its normal pace everywhere except in this specific room, under these specific lights, where something that had been building for 20 years had finally run out of room to keep building. The monitors kept beeping. Nobody moved. Kingston had spent 20 years building a particular kind of reputation. Not just surgical skill, though that was real and documented, and the reason his name still appeared in 3 medical journals published within the last 18 months. But skill alone doesn't make you untouchable in a hospital. Skill makes you valuable. What made Kingston untouchable was something else entirely: the accumulated social architecture of 2 decades spent making himself indispensable to the right people and invisible to scrutiny from above. Donor relationships, board proximity. The careful, patient work of ensuring that every person who might one day sit in judgment of him either owed him something or was afraid of what he knew. That architecture had held through 4 internal complaints, 2 knee investigations, and 1 settlement that had cost the hospital $60,000 and required 3 signatures from board members who never publicly acknowledged it happened. It had never been tested like this. He looked at Addison now with the specific expression of a man who has decided that the fastest way out of a corner is through the person who backed him into it. Let me ask everyone something. He addressed the room, not her specifically, the residents, the nurses, the General Assembly of Mercy General staff who were pretending very hard to be doing other things. His voice had recovered its authority, the practiced resonance of a man who had given grand rounds presentations and delivered bad news to families and charmed rooms full of hospital donors over rubber chicken dinners. We are standing here in a functioning emergency department because of a complaint about a medication protocol, and somehow that has turned into, he gestured vaguely at Munn, at the locked doors, at the accumulated weight of the last 40 minutes, this. He turned and pointed directly at Addison. You think this nurse matters enough to shut down an ER? The room went very quiet. Not the performed quietness of people pretending to work. Actual quiet. The kind where you can hear the ventilation system running in the ceiling and the distant sound of a cart moving somewhere down the hall outside. Addison felt the point of his finger like a physical thing. She was aware of her own heartbeat, the tenderness in her wrist, the morphine syringe still sitting in the tray on the cart where she'd set it down, the 63-year-old woman in base 6 with the fractured hip, still waiting because all of this had been happening while a real patient sat alone in real pain. That awareness, the patient waiting, was the thing that steadied her more than anything else. She looked at Kingston directly. I matter, she said. Not loud, she didn't perform it. She just said it the way you state your own name, plainly, without apology, without the slight upward tilt that turns a statement into a question. The 2 words landed in the room differently than anything else that had been said in the last 40 minutes. Maybe because everything else had been argument, maneuvering, pressure applied and absorbed. This was something else, simple and declarative and completely unmovable. Ryan Cho set his tablet down on the counter behind him. I'll testify, he said. Whatever the investigation needs, I'll testify. Kingston turned to him. Dr. Cho, I'd encourage you to think very carefully. I already thought about it. Ryan's voice cracked slightly on the last word, but he didn't take it back. He was 26 years old with $280,000 in debt, and he was still standing there. I've been thinking about it for 8 months, actually. Sandra Okafor finally looked up from her computer screen, fully directly without the protective angle she'd been maintaining. I have dates, she said. Incidents, I kept notes. In my personal files, not the system. A pause, I didn't trust the system. Priya Mehta stepped forward from where she'd been standing at the edge of the residence cluster. She didn't say anything immediately. She just moved her position, physically crossed from Kingston's side of the room to the open space near the medication cart, near Addison, and that movement said everything her words hadn't formed yet. A nurse named Dominique, who worked surgical overflow and had been in the ER covering a shift, uncrossed her arms. There was a travel nurse, she said, Becca, last year, before she transferred. She told me what happened in the supply corridor, but she said she wasn't going to report it because she'd seen what happened to the people who did. Kingston's neck was fully red now, past the collar line, creeping up toward his jaw. This was the phenomenon that psychologists who study institutional abuse call the cascade, the moment when the first person speaks publicly and the social calculation for everyone else changes. It's not that the second or third person suddenly becomes braver. It's that the first person's public statement absorbs the risk that everyone else had been privately carrying. The cost of silence and the cost of speaking suddenly aren't what they were 60 seconds ago. Kingston had kept the costs calibrated in his favor for years. Ryan Cho's 2 sentences had just recalibrated them. I want all of you to understand something. Kingston's voice had dropped lower, private meeting low, the register he used when he wanted to convey that the real conversation was happening beneath the audible one. What you say today has consequences, for your careers, for your references, for where you land after this program. His eyes moved from Ryan to Priya to Dominique with the slow precision of a man marking targets. I have been at this hospital for 20 years. I have relationships with every attending on this floor, with the department chairs, with the board. That doesn't go away because of one. The ER doors burst open. Not the entrance doors, which were still locked. The trauma bay doors from the ambulance bay, which operated on a separate system and opened when incoming called ahead. They hit the wall with the particular crack that everyone on the floor knew meant incoming hot, critical, no time, clear the bay. The paramedics came through fast, gurney moving at the speed that made everyone's body respond before their brain caught up. The patient was a man, somewhere in his 50s, chest compressions ongoing from the paramedic on the side rail, oxygen mask, the controlled urgency of people who had been working a code since the parking structure 2 blocks away where he'd collapsed next to his car. VFib 3 rounds of epi, no sustained rhythm, the lead paramedic called out. CPR continuous, last check 2 minutes ago. The ER reorganized itself in seconds the way it was built to do. Nurses moved, the crash cart unlocked, a respiratory tech appeared from the side corridor. And Kingston moved. It was pure instinct, the deepest professional reflex he had. Trauma arrives, Kingston leads. He was already pulling on gloves, already stepping toward the bay, already cataloging, airway, rhythm, access points, the specific mental sequencing of a trauma surgeon who had run hundreds of these and whose hands knew the work before his conscious mind finished the sentence. He was 3 steps from the bay entrance when a hand went up in front of him. Not grabbing, not touching, just up, flat palm, the unmistakable signal for stop. Dr. Harold Beaumont, Chief Medical Officer of Mercy General for the last 7 years, was not a man who spent much time on the ER floor. He was an administrator now, mostly, meetings, budgets, accreditation reviews, the slow bureaucratic work of keeping a hospital functioning at a systems level. He was 61 years old, slightly soft around the middle, and wearing the kind of unremarkable grey suit that hospital administrators wore when they weren't expecting to be in a situation that required anything from them physically. He had been standing in the observation corridor behind the nursing station for the last 22 minutes. Watching. Step away from the patient, Beaumont said. Kingston stopped, looked at the hand, looked at Beaumont. His gloves were half on. Harold, there's a code. Dr. Ewan will take the lead. Beaumont's voice was flat and very certain. Dr. Angela Ewan, who was already at the bay entrance, nodded once and moved through without breaking stride. Kingston pulled the glove the rest of the way onto his left hand by reflex, a useless gesture. You can't be serious. You're going to pull me in the middle of an active. You're suspended pending investigation, effective immediately. Beaumont said it at the same volume he would have used to read a lunch order. That means you are not authorized to treat patients in this facility until the review is concluded. The word suspended moved through the room like a current. Not loudly, nobody gasped dramatically, nobody dropped anything. But the quality of attention in the ER changed. The nurses who had been watching the trauma bay doors shifted their eyes to Kingston, then to Beaumont, then back, the involuntary triangulation of people trying to understand what they were witnessing. Kingston stood very still for a moment. The gloves were on both hands now, which meant he was standing at the entrance to a trauma bay fully gloved and going nowhere, which was its own kind of exposure. 20 years, he said, low, barely controlled. I built this trauma department, that robotics lab, the simulation wing, the residency program. I was here for all of it. You're going to suspend me over a documented pattern of physical and verbal misconduct, Beaumont said, supported by security footage and witness statements, some of which I have been reviewing for the past hour. He looked at Kingston without hostility and without warmth. This is not a conversation, Daniel, it's a notification. There was a Korean concept Mun had thought about often in the years since he'd started working in American institutions, Korchhamyun, pronounced Kemyun, the idea of social face. Not vanity exactly, but the accumulated public dignity that a person builds over a career, the way their standing is perceived by everyone around them. Korean business culture treated Kemyun with enormous seriousness. Losing it publicly in front of colleagues and subordinates was considered one of the most significant professional injuries a person could sustain, not because of ego, but because professional relationships in high-context cultures were built on trust in a person's presented self. When that face cracked visibly, everything built on it became unstable. American hospitals ran on the same principle, even if nobody called it Kemyun. Kingston had built 20 years of it. The residents were watching him. The nurses were watching him. The patients in the open bays who had been following the entire morning's events from behind thin curtains were watching him. The orderly near the supply room door had not moved in 40 minutes. He pulled the gloves off, one then the other. The snap of latex in the silence was very loud. He looked at Addison. She held his gaze without looking away, and he was the one who moved first. He looked at Ryans, who looked back. He looked at Sandra, who had turned fully in her chair to face him. He looked at Mun Shi-hoon, who had been standing to the side of everything, still in the charcoal overcoat, watching with the patient attention of someone who had known how this would end before the doors opened, and had simply been waiting for the room to arrive there. Mun spoke quietly, not for the room, directed at Kingston specifically, the way you speak to someone when the conversation is actually over and what remains is just the landing. Consequences are educational, he said. Most people only need to learn them once. Kingston said nothing. He walked to the far end of the nurse's station, picked up his badge and his phone from the counter where he'd set them, and stood there for a moment with his back partially to the room. Then he walked toward the staff exit. He didn't run, he didn't shout. He left the way powerful people leave when the power has just changed hands, upright, controlled on the surface, with the particular stiffness of someone managing an interior situation that their exterior is not going to show. The staff exit door swung closed behind him. In the trauma bay, Dr. Angela Ewan called for another round, and the rhythm of the code continued, and the ER kept running the way it always kept running, because the floor doesn't stop for anyone. But the residents were standing differently, and the nurses were looking at each other in a new way. And Addison was still at the medication cart, and she picked up the syringe she'd set down 40-something minutes ago, and she checked it, and she walked toward Bay 6, where a 63-year-old woman with a fractured hip had been waiting long enough. The woman in Bay 6 finally got her morphine. Addison stood at the bedside and watched the medication take hold the way it always did, not dramatically, not like the movies where relief floods a face all at once, but gradually, the specific softening of muscles that have been clenched against pain for so long they'd forgotten another position was available. The woman's name was Gloria Reyes. 63 years old, retired school librarian, fractured hip from a fall on her front porch steps that her neighbor had been asking her to fix for 2 years. "Thank you, sweetheart," Gloria said, her voice loose now, edges rounded. "Sorry for the wait," Addison said. Gloria looked at her with the clear, unhurried attention of someone whose pain had just stepped back far enough to allow observation. She'd been in Bay 6 for the entire morning. She'd heard everything. "Don't apologize," Gloria said simply. "You held your ground." Addison tucked the blanket around her legs and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say to that, and because her throat was doing something inconvenient that she didn't want to perform in front of a patient. She documented the medication, checked the IV line, and walked back to the station. The ER had resumed its operational rhythm. Not fully, not the way it ran on a normal Tuesday when the biggest interpersonal drama was who'd taken the last coffee from the break room pot without starting a new one. But the mechanical work of the floor was moving again, monitors, charts, the quiet coordination of people whose job required them to keep going regardless of what else was happening around them. Dr. Angela Ewan had the trauma bay stabilized. The man from the parking structure had a rhythm now, still critical but present. Mun Shi-hoon was standing near the corridor entrance, his overcoat still on, his phone in his hand. He'd been making quiet calls for the last 10 minutes, speaking in Korean, his voice low enough that only the nearest sentences were audible to anyone passing. Addison had caught fragments, numbers, a name she didn't recognize, the word "cornet," repeated in the way Koreans said yes when they were listening carefully and confirming understanding rather than just agreeing. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, then answered. This call was different. He didn't speak for almost a full minute, just listened, standing very still with the phone pressed to his ear, his free hand loose at his side. Then he walked directly to Harold Beaumont, who was standing near the nurse's station reviewing something on a tablet, and held the phone out. Beaumont looked at it, then at Mun. "Board chair," Mun said. Beaumont took the phone. What followed was a 4-minute conversation in which Beaumont said very little and mostly listened, occasionally saying yes, once saying "I understand," once saying "that's already been initiated" in the tone of a man who is simultaneously receiving information and managing how surprised he appears to be by it. When he handed the phone back to Mun, his expression had reorganized itself into something careful and deliberate. "Emergency governance review," he said, mostly to himself. Then louder, to no one in particular and everyone present, "The board has convened an emergency session." Sandra Okafor looked up from her computer. Ryan Cho, who had been sitting on a stool near the medication cart since Kingston left, sat up straighter. Beaumont looked at Mun. "Robert Kingston has resigned from the board." The name landed with weight for anyone who knew the internal geography of this hospital. Dr. Daniel Kingston's father had held a board seat for 14 years. He had been, depending on who you asked, either a generous philanthropist who supported Mercy General's expansion through personal giving, or the specific reason that 4 formal complaints against his son had been filed, reviewed, and quietly shelved before any of them produced consequences. The two things were not mutually exclusive. In American hospital governance, as in many institutional systems, financial generosity and protected misconduct often operated as a paired transaction, not explicitly, never explicitly, but as a structural reality that everyone who moved in those circles understood without needing it said aloud. In Korean business culture, this kind of arrangement was called yeonjol, a network of relationships and obligations that existed parallel to the formal hierarchy and often held more actual power than the org chart suggested. Mun had spent his career learning to map these networks in institutions he was evaluating, because the formal structure of a place told you what it wanted you to see, while the yeonjol told you how it actually functioned. He had mapped Mercy General's in 3 weeks. The staff exit door from the previous corridor opened. Kingston walked back in. He had his jacket on now, his badge clipped at his chest, his keys in his hand, the geometry of a man who has gone to collect his things and returned for one more conversation that he has not fully accepted is already over. His eyes went straight to Addison. He crossed the floor toward her, and nobody stopped him because he hadn't been physically escorted out, just told to leave, and told men like Kingston things enough times that you understood the first exit was rarely the final one. "Let me tell you something," he said, stopping about 4 feet from her. His voice had the controlled quietness of a man keeping his register down because he knew the room was still watching. "You think this is winning. You have no idea what you've actually started. My attorneys will have this reviewed by Thursday. The board review is a formality. My surgical record is impeccable. My outcomes are." "Daniel," Beaumont's voice from across the room, flat and final. Kingston ignored it. His eyes stayed on Addison. "You think you've won?" Addison looked at him. She was aware of the morphine tray she'd set down earlier, still on the cart. The redness on her wrist had darkened into the early bruising that would be fully visible by tomorrow. She was aware of Ryan sitting behind her, and Sandra turned in her chair, and Priya near the supply room entrance. She was aware of Gloria Reyes in Bay 6, whose blanket she'd just tucked, who'd said you held your ground with the simple certainty of someone who had been watching people hold or lose ground for 63 years. "No," Addison said, "I didn't win anything." She held his gaze and didn't look away. "I just refused to stay silent." Kingston opened his mouth and closed it again. Whatever he had prepared for anger, tears, argument, collapse, that answer wasn't it. It didn't give him anything to push against. It was too plain, too settled, too entirely without the performance he needed to counter. Mun Shi-hoon spoke from behind him. "Can I tell you something?" "Doctor." Kingston turned. Mun had put his phone away. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, and his expression had the particular quality that Addison had noticed from the beginning, not hard, not cold, but fully inhabited. present in the room the way most people in a conflict weren't, because most people in a conflict were also fighting the version of events playing in their own heads simultaneously. Mun seemed to only be here in this one room in this specific moment. "I had a sister," he said. "Mun Jae-yeon, she was a nurse, pediatric oncology, Seoul National University Hospital." He paused, very good at her work, the kind of nurse that parents requested by name. She had a patient list she'd kept for 4 years, kids she'd followed through treatment, whose parents still sent her messages at Chuseok. Chuseok was the Korean Harvest Festival, roughly equivalent to Thanksgiving in its function, as a moment of family gathering and the sending of gifts and messages to people you were grateful for. For parents of sick children to remember a nurse years after treatment at that specific occasion said something precise about the kind of care she'd given. Kingston said nothing. "She had a superior," Mun continued, "senior attending, well-regarded, good surgical numbers, well-liked by administration." He didn't inflect those words with bitterness. He stated them the way you state facts that have long since lost the power to surprise you. He made her work very difficult, specific kind of difficult. She filed a report. The report was reviewed. A pause, then it wasn't. He looked at Kingston steadily. "She transferred hospitals, different department. She thought distance would make it workable." He was quiet for a moment. 2 years later she left medicine completely. She'd spent 11 years becoming a specialist in pediatric oncology nursing. 11 years of night shifts and licensing exams and watching children go through things adults couldn't survive, and she was exceptional at it, and she left, not because she wanted to. Because the institution made the cost of staying higher than she could pay. The ER kept its background noise, a monitor somewhere, the low roll of a cart. "I watched her career disappear," Mun said. "I watched what that does to a person who has built their entire professional self around a vocation. It's not like losing a job. It's like losing a language you spent your whole life learning to speak." He looked at Kingston for a long moment. "I will not watch it happen again," he said. "Not here, not to her, not to anyone in this building." There was a concept in Korean emotional culture, han, that didn't translate cleanly into English. It was a kind of grief that had been compressed over time, a sorrow that had nowhere to go and so became something else. Perseverance, quiet intensity, the particular determination of someone who has absorbed a loss and let it become fuel rather than weight. Mun didn't perform it. But it was present in the room with him in the way that real things are present, taking up space without announcing themselves. Kingston looked at him, then at Addison, then at the assembled ER staff who were not looking away, who had stopped pretending to work, who were simply watching with the frank attention of people who had witnessed something they would describe later to people at home and not quite be able to fully convey. 2 security guards entered from the main entrance. Webb had made a call somewhere in the last few minutes. They crossed the floor without urgency and stopped on either side of Kingston at a professional distance. "Dr. Kingston," one of them said, "we'll walk you out." It wasn't a question. Kingston looked at the guards. Then he did the thing that surprised everyone, which was nothing. No explosion, no final declaration, no last attempt to reclaim the narrative. He just turned and walked, one guard on each side, through the ER floor, past the nurse's station, past the bays where patients had been listening through curtains, past the medication cart where a syringe tray still sat from a medication that had finally been delivered 40 minutes late. The staff did not look away. That was the thing, that was the entire thing, and it was small enough to miss and enormous enough that everyone in the room felt it. In every previous incident, every previous moment where Kingston had crossed a line and the room had watched it happen, the response had been the same. Look down, look away, find the nearest chart or screen or task and let the moment pass. The institutional reflex of self-preservation. But this time, as he walked the length of the floor, the eyes followed him. Sandra Okafor, Ryan Cho, Priya Mehta, Dominique, 3 patients who had pulled their curtains open, an orderly who had been near the supply room door for so long he'd probably forgotten he was still holding a linen cart. They watched him leave. The exterior doors opened and closed. The ER exhaled. Not collectively, not in a way that anyone performed or acknowledged, just the room settling back into itself the way a body settles after something has passed through it. The monitors resumed their authority. A phone rang at the station and Sandra picked it up on the second ring, her voice normal, professional, entirely herself. Ryan picked up his tablet from the counter and looked at it for a moment, and then put it back down because whatever was on it was going to have to wait. Beaumont spoke briefly with Mun near the corridor entrance, their voices low, the conversation short. Then Beaumont walked toward his office, and the ER absorbed his departure without ceremony. Mun picked up the overcoat from the chair in Bay 11, where he'd set it at some point in the last hour. He folded it over his arm. looked around the room once with the same methodical attention he'd had from the beginning. Addison was at the nurse's station, updating the documentation she'd fallen behind on. Her wrist was on the desk surface, the bruising visible now, purpling slightly at the center where his grip had been tightest. She'd file the incident report this afternoon. The formal one, with photographs of the injury and a full written account, submitted through the external reporting channel that Munn's legal team had apparently already flagged to the hospital as the appropriate pathway given the board's compromised position on internal complaints. She looked up when she heard him moving toward the entrance. "Mr. Munn." He stopped. She came around the station and stood in front of him in the middle of the ER floor, in the space between the central desk and Bay 3, under the fluorescent lights that washed everything out and never fully turned off. "You changed everything," she said. He shook his head, small, certain movement. "No." He looked at her directly. The same way he'd looked at her when he first crossed the room and asked, "Are you hurt?" and understood what her answer actually meant. "You did," he said, "the moment you refused to stay quiet." She wanted to argue it because the version where she had changed anything required ignoring the reality that she had filed a report 14 months ago and nothing had happened, that she had been moved to night shifts, that she had learned over 6 years which battles to pick, and how to survive the ones she didn't pick. She wanted to say that she hadn't refused to stay quiet so much as she'd been caught in a moment where quiet was no longer an available option. But she thought about Ryan, who had set down his tablet and said, "I'll testify," with a cracking voice, and hadn't taken it back. She thought about Sandra, who had kept personal notes in her private files because she didn't trust the system but had kept them anyway, which was its own kind of refusal. She thought about Gloria Ray's in Bay 6 saying you held your ground with the clean, unsentimental observation of someone who had been watching people hold or lose it for 63 years. Maybe that's what it was, not one person's courage, just the decision, made again and again in small ordinary moments, to not make yourself smaller than you were, to not call "I'm fine" when you weren't, to not look down when someone needed to be looked at. The ER doors opened ahead of Munn as he stepped toward them, the automatic sensor catching his movement. The sound of the street came through briefly, traffic, a distant siren, the particular noise of a city continuing regardless, and then the doors closed behind him and the floor's controlled internal atmosphere resumed. Addison stood in the middle of the ER floor for a moment. A nurse called her name from Bay 8, something about a discharge form. She turned and went. The monitors kept their rhythms. A gurney rolled past. 2 interns came through the staff entrance for the afternoon rotation, talking about something that had nothing to do with any of this, not yet. The news traveling the way news traveled in hospitals, through lunch breaks and shift handoffs, and the specific conversational intimacy of people who spent 12 hours at a time in close proximity to hard things. The fluorescent lights ran the same as they always had. Pallid, constant, washing color out of everything, making the sick look sicker and the tired look half-dead. But at the medication cart outside Bay 6, where a syringe tray still sat on the surface, in the exact spot where a man had grabbed a woman's wrist and told her to act like a nurse, Addison Keller stood and did her job, steady, unhurried, entirely herself. And for the first time in 6 years, the ER felt like it was hers too. What would you have done if you'd been standing in that ER?
If this story moved you, share it with someone who works in a system that protects the wrong people. And if you've ever been the person in that ER who looked away, or the one who didn't, tell us which one in the comments. We read every single one.